Now let's add a couple more things before we go any further so that things are a little bit more clear. Once we get outside of the editor, a lot of the kind of notes, the comments, as well as the things that we named our variables are obscured. So let's take a second to actually add some more information into our Grasshopper definition so that we understand what this object is doing. So what I'm going to do is first, I'm going to right-click my slider here on the title, and I'm going to rename it to sphere radius. And that will give me a better indication of what exactly that is. Right? And then the other thing that we're going to do is we're going to take this point container and we're going to go to Edit, Group. So we'll group that object to itself, which gives us a rectangle around it that's behind it. And we can right-click on that actual rectangle and say Sphere Center. Right? So that will act as a label. Right? And if your objects don't look like mine, I'd encourage you to go to Draw Icons. And that way you'll see the icons and all the objects. And then once again, to group objects, you're going to select the object to Edit, Group Selection, or Control-G, and then give it a name. All right, so whereas before, if I was using the Rhino Python editor, in order to make a new version or test a different value, I'd have to run the script again. Run it again, and choose center points and define radiuses. The difference here is that if I do this inside of Grasshopper, I have a live preview of the current state of the result of my script. And that can be really rewarding because you can calibrate things very easily. Okay, I don't want it to be too small, the sphere, maybe a little bit bigger. And I only have one single live version. If I like that sphere, I can then bake it. And that way I'd have it as Rhino geometry as opposed to just a preview. And then proceed from there. All right, so a little bit differently, if we're using this in Grasshopper, a little bit, the difference is that we have kind of a live version as opposed to the version that was created at a particular point in time through the Rhino Python script editor. Okay, so let's take a second to answer any questions you might have, and if you have any, just go ahead and drop them in the questions window before we move on to the next exercise. Okay, there is a question about a couple of questions that are really relevant. The first one has to do with the output of the the Python, GHPython object. This output is labeled as A, right? A is the name of this output, right? So where any wire that comes out of here, right, is going to be given A. So inside of our script, we stored my sphere, and then we said A equals my sphere. One of you asked, could you not just return my sphere? You could. So if you wanted to do that, you would have to not have this last line, and you'd have to change the output here from A to my sphere and make those two things be the same. If I test that, everything is okay, right? So that's a really good question because my sphere, or even if you just said sphere, that's much better or I guess a more clear label for what's actually coming out of here than just A, right? So if you wanted to get really specific, you could do the same thing for X and Y. You could take X and say this is my radius. You could say that Y is, sorry, I have that backwards. X would become my point. Y would become my radius. And I'm just right-clicking and defining what those labels are. If I did all that, I wouldn't even have to have these two lines either. And comment those out. Success. All right, so it's one line of code actually inside of the object that allows us to create the sphere. All right, but I wanted you guys to get comfortable with working with variables and understanding the difference between rs.getPoint versus defining a point as an input. Okay, the other question has to do with what out is. Out is a special case. This is something that is just like it's whatever is stored in here, right? So if you have any errors or you want to send out any information, for instance, you could say that you wanted to print out the size of the sphere. You could say print size equals plus my radius. All right, it's not as easy as that. Let's say, I'll just make it a little bit simpler. All right, size equals, right? You're sending out messages into the output that are not based on things you created in the script, but are based on the print window, or what's also called the output window, right? So that's it's a way to actually debug things inside of the GHPython object. Also a really great question. Okay, so if you wanted to change these variable names here so that you clean up your code, they have to be the exact same as what you're using in here, right? So my point camel case, my radius camel case, and then my sphere as the output, right? So again, you have to be sensitive to all of your case and space inputs when you're typing in those values at the object level as well as inside of your script. Okay, I see a couple more questions. We're going to get specifically, a couple of you asked, what happens if I want to have more than two variables? Really great question. That's what we're going to do next. Sneak peek, if you zoom in to your object, if you get close enough, you'll see that there are some ways to manipulate how exactly this object looks. All right, so we'll come back to that in the very next exercise. All right, so again, really great questions. You guys are on point and sharp. So I'm going to save this. This is create sphere, the Grasshopper version.